Hello and welcome to GameSack. We're talking about the Retron 5 emulation machine or whatever you want to call it.
Whatever you want to call it. You probably already watched 5 reviews about it from other reviewers, but ours is the only one you really need.
It really is. And thanks to Eric from Let's Get for lending us his unit. That's him on the TV, conveniently located behind us. And he's also on the Video Game Years, which we're on too. And I even edit part of that. So you should watch that.
It's a great show and it's a great history lesson.
Yeah. Anyway, we tested out the Retron 5 and we've come to our certain conclusions. And in the meantime, let's tell you a little bit more about the console itself.
Yeah.
The Hyperkin Retron 5. This $140 unit plays games for the Genesis and Mega Drive, Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, NES, regular non-Super Famicom, as well as Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. It comes with a wireless controller that has a micro-switch control pad similar to the Neo Geo Pocket Color, though the build quality isn't quite as nice. You can plug in real Genesis, NES, and Super NES controllers to use them to play games from any platform. And if you've got a player too, hey, there's controller ports on the other side. Light guns for any system are just not gonna work. In order to turn the unit on, you must press and hold the power button on the console and wait. And wait. And wait. Takes a while. The console features an HDMI output only and it outputs at 720p 60 frames per second. The Retron 5 runs on an Android-based operating system with a Z-Link Spartan FPGA and a Rockchip processor. There's 1.2 gigabytes of internal storage for save files, screenshots, save states, and you can also put in an SD card for added space. And no, the system will not play ROMs off of the SD card, but you know some people are probably going to hack it sometime in the future. That's because the SD card, which you provide yourself, is the method that you'll use to update the firmware. There's tons of settings in the main menu screen where you can apply different filters, audio adjustments, controller button mappings, and so on. To use cheats in a game, you gotta download a file from Hyperkin's website. Step 5 is enjoy. I had trouble with step 5. The cartridges are pretty tough to insert and often even more difficult to remove. It's like they didn't even measure the thickness of the PCB boards when designing the thing. Look at these pins on the Super Nintendo slot. They're already bent out of shape. Same with the Famicom slot. Now they still work, but it makes me kind of wonder about Hyperkin's quality control. Please kill me! During gameplay, there are several graphical filters that you can apply. These can be done via the in-game menu, which you can access by pressing down and start at the same time. Each and every one of these causes a slight loss in detail, and to be honest, I don't care for the look of any of them. They look really smeary. There's also a scanline mode if you like that kind of thing. It makes playing on a non-CRT TV a little bit more tolerable, I guess, but I usually leave it off. Anyway, the video output quality is pretty damn good. Here's how Sonic looks on the Retron 5. Nice and clear with none of the smearing that you'd normally see in composite video on a real system. And here's how Sonic looks on a real Genesis. This right here was recorded in RGB and every real Genesis has an RGB video output built right in, though most TVs in the US can't accept such a signal. Now while the audio isn't 100% accurate to the real systems, I imagine it's close enough for most people. Here's how the real Genesis sounds. And here's the Retron 5. And here's the enhanced audio mode. Sounds like you're in a hollow tunnel or a big room. I didn't care for the enhanced audio mode. You have to back all the way out to the main menu to access the audio stuff. You can't access it via the in-game menu. Now let's do the same comparison on a bit of music from Streets of Rage 2. The makers of the Retron 5, Hyperkin, have stated that they wanted as close to 100% compatibility as they could possibly get. So, how'd they do? Well, on the Super Nintendo, Star Fox plays fine, and that one features a Super FX chip. However, Doom, which also features an FX chip, had problems. Initially, we couldn't even get it to work at all, but when we did, it looked like this. And I don't think it's supposed to look like that. Super Mario RPG, a game which is known to have issues with clone consoles, seems to work well enough for me, but I couldn't get the save files to write back to the cartridge. This feature currently doesn't work very well at all. In fact, I was never able to get it to work. Fortunately, there's a save state feature which lets you take snapshots at any time during a game. You can later resume from that point. A Super Famicom game, Tales of Fantasia, seemed to run okay, but it didn't read my save files correctly from the cart. Super Castlevania 4 of course runs well enough. It'd be a crime if this one didn't work. The Super Game Boy loads up, but it won't load the Game Boy game inserted into it. Over on the Genesis side, Streets of Rage 2 works well, but look at the floor as the screen is scrolling. That looks awful. But if you enable the Force Original Resolution option in the system menu, that's fixed. In fact, I recommend leaving that enabled all the time, even though the screen ends up being slightly smaller. It makes the game look more accurate as a result. Musha works great, but if you have this game, you probably already have a real Genesis as well. Now everyone is probably wondering if Altered Beast works. It does. GameStack is the only show on the internet that is brave enough to test Altered Beast.
Welcome to your doom.
Now how about Japanese Mega Drive games? Well, they fit in the slot, and games like Curse seem to run fine. But Mega Drive games made by Sunsoft, well, they won't fit. So if you want to play Panorama Cotton, you can just go straight to hell. How about Virtua Racing, which contains a special chip in the cartridge? It runs pretty well, and I'll also take this opportunity to mention that the 6-button controller also seems to work. Well, except for the mode button. In some games like Techno Clash, the mode button can be pressed to use health potions that you've stored up. When I press it, the Retron 5 simply doesn't recognize it at all, and I die. That sucks. Okay, what about Sonic and Knuckles? Yeah, it seems to run fine. But what about Sonic 3 and Knuckles? Nope, the Retron 5 only sees Sonic and Knuckles. The Game Genie loads up and allows you to input codes, but it won't run any games attached to it, it just keeps resetting. So how about Watermelon's 2010 Genesis RPG Pure Solar? Well, after a rather lengthy loading period, it says unknown cartridge. It loads the first screen for a microsecond and then you get nothing but a red screen. How about Beggar Prince, which is a localized Chinese RPG? Nope, it doesn't even see the cart. In fact, it doesn't see any of Super Fighter Team's carts. If you have a power-based converter, you can even play Sega Master System games. Here's Castle of Illusion in case you haven't guessed that already. How about some Rastan? It turns out if a game makes use of the FM sound hardware in the Japanese Master System, it runs the game in FM. There's no option to listen to the normal PSG soundtrack. So how about Wonder Boy 3, which will only run in FM if it boots on a Japanese system? Yep, it comes up as Monster World 2 and runs in FM. Even if you force the USA region in the system settings, it still boots up as Monster World 2. Apparently the region settings don't work very well. Now while the Retron 5 will not work with the Master System controller, you can still play games that require it like Alien Syndrome using the Genesis controller. Can't do that on a real system. What's interesting is that F-16 Fighting Falcon works, and this game doesn't even run on the Genesis since it requires a legacy SG-1000 mode, which the Genesis just doesn't have. So the Retron 5 could potentially run SG-1000 games. How about Sega Master System 3D games? Well, it runs them, but only in 2D. The screen doesn't flicker back and forth like it would if it were running in 3D mode. If you plug the glasses into the power-based converter, the glasses darken and occasionally flutter, but they don't flicker back and forth like they do when running a 3D game on a real Master System or Genesis. That's because they're not being controlled by the software when they're running on the Retron 5. Okay, how about the 32X? Nope, you guessed it, doesn't work. But if you apply power to it and insert a regular Genesis game, that game will actually load and run. It will load up 32X games, but it won't recognize the carts and it won't run them. If only the cart slot would allow 32X games to fit, then it could potentially run 32X games with the firmware update even without the 32X hardware. I'm amazed that Hyperkin didn't even think about that. Things seem to mostly work on the NES side. Some games have an occasional glitch in the graphics, but most of the ones I tried work fine. 3D World Runner works, and even the 3D mode works if you have a pair of red and blue anaglyph glasses. The 3D in this game sucks though. Castlevania 3 works well, and this one has an MMC5 chip on the cart. Even the Japanese version of Castlevania 3 works. This one does not have an MMC5, it has a different helper chip and also a special sound chip to boost the music quality over what the NES is normally capable of. Fortunately, you get to hear the extra audio channel on the Retron 5. So how does it compare to the real thing? Well, here's how it sounds on the Retron 5. And here's how it sounds on a real system. The Famicom game Quinty is recognized, but for some reason it doesn't run at all. Amazingly, the US version, which is called Mendel's Palace, runs fine. On the Game Boy side, we had to give the Castlevania Adventure a good cleaning before it worked, but it eventually did. DuckTales 2 worked fine, as did Blaster Master Boy. Man, is this Blaster Master or friggin' Bomberman? For the Game Boy Color, we tried R-Type DX. It plays well and even in color. Wow, Game Boy games in color. Who would have thought? I don't have too many Game Boy Advance games, but Super Monkey Ball Jr. seems to run. This game kinda sucks though, it really needs an analog controller. Here's a much better game, F-Zero Maximum Velocity. It runs well, except that it didn't load my game saves from the cart properly. For comparison, here's what it looks and sounds like while running on the GameCube's Game Boy player in 480p over component video. Drill Dozer plays fine, but the cartridge does not rumble. Kirby Tilt and Tumble fails to load the ROM. And it's too bad too. Can you even imagine how fun this would be to play on the Retron 5? Absolutely no flash carts that I tried were able to work. Overall, the Retron 5 plays a lot of video games, and the ones it doesn't can possibly be fixed with a future firmware update. But will they? Alright, that's the Hyperkin Retron 5. Dave, what are your opinions?
Well, in all honesty, Joe, it's not for me. I mean, I'd rather have 5 different pieces of hardware to play all these games instead of just one where you actually have to have the cartridge in the slot to play the game, and you're not guaranteed that the game's going to work.
True.
You know, so It has some compatibility issues, obviously. If that's something that you like, that's great, and maybe you want to save on space, but you're gonna still need a lot of games to, actual games to play on this thing. So.
Yes, because it does not run ROMs.
No, which is crazy. Yeah. But who knows? Maybe the Retron 5.1 will run ROMs, but who knows? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, like you, it's not something that I would actually purchase.
Yeah.
It's just not for me. I'm kind of a purist. I know people don't necessarily like that. They think it's like elitism or whatever. But I just like playing on the real consoles. But this was really fun to play with. It's just not something I would get. And I don't know. It's just you can update the firmware so the compatibility issues may be fixed in the future. But in order to download the firmware, you can't even find a firmware download link on Hyperkin's Retron 5 site. It's nowhere to be found. In fact, the only place I was able to find a firmware download link was on Hyperkin's Facebook page, which is not really very intuitive.
No, that's horrible.
Yeah, and I guess they fixed some of the cartridge save transfer bugs and stuff like that since. And what I would also like to see is Game Genie and like Pro Action Replay support, where you can just put in the codes instead of having to download a cheat file from Hyperkin's website, which is totally also not intuitive and not very convenient. Just put a little code entry thing into the software. I don't know, but it's just not really fun.
Yeah, it just needs a lot more work. I mean, it's a good start, but it's not there yet.
Yeah,
it's not completely there.
But it is interesting, a little interesting product there. And again, thanks to Eric for letting us check out your Hyperkin Retron 5.
Thanks, Eric.
And maybe I'll even give it back to you. And in the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Oh yeah, it's gonna be nice. If they like the PlayStation video, they are gonna love this one. Oh my goodness. Oh yeah, you give it to that Retron 5. Oh yeah. Only 6,127 more frames to go, and this will be ready.
What are you doing, dude?
Whoa, what are you doing here?
I'm getting back my... This is mine.
Yeah?
You're gonna give it a virus. I shudder to think what you would have done with these ports.